Happy Monday, boys and girls. Hope you had a great weekend. I got a lot of things done around the house this weekend, and it was nice outside. I hope you got outside some too. I want to say a cheery hello in hopes that everybody's doing well. Okay, we're going to start our new novel tomorrow, and it's called Homework Machine. I think you'll like it. It's going to be fun, no sad. I've been promised it was not sad. But today we're going to finish reading the book about if you lived at the time of the Civil War. Remember, I have posted some things on slavery and some of the things that led up to the Civil War. And so now we're reading about the Civil War, which I told you was when the states fought each other. So if you didn't hear the first part Friday, you need to go back. So the North and the South were fighting about several things. One thing was that the South wanted to continue with slavery, and the North didn't have the big plantations, and they didn't want to continue with it. Okay, so we read about the chores. Today we're starting with, did you continue to go to school in the North? If you lived in the North during the war, did you get to go to school? Now, if you remember, we read Friday that most of the war, the fighting, took place in the South. So it affected the people in the South, I would say, more so because the battles took place on their land. All right, so did you continue to go to school in the North? It's kind of dark in here. There, that's a little bit better. All right, most Northern children continued to go to public school during the war. You would be in school from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Wow, they went longer than us. Maybe they didn't go every day. I don't know. You'd spend your day reading from a McGuffey reader, doing sums and writing on a slate, and memorizing pieces to say out loud. The war did affect the schools when schoolmasters were drafted. Women took over as teachers or the school was closed. Illinois teachers had to make a loyalty oath before they could teach. This meant they had to swear that they believed in the Union. They would only teach things that supported the Union side of the war. Some children, especially those who had come from Europe, worked in the factories with their parents. The work was hard and the pay was poor. But the families needed the money, so there was no choice, even if the child would have wanted to go to school. You're lucky today, aren't you, that you get to go to school? Except right now we're not so lucky, but hopefully things are going to change soon. Sometimes boys took vacations from school to visit their fathers in the Army. If you were 12-year-old Fred Grant, you weren't in school in 1863, but with your father, General Ulysses S. Grant, as he worked to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi. Often the boys stayed on by joining the Army. So Ulysses S. Grant was a big general, and you'll hear about him a lot in the Civil War. Did you continue to school if you lived in the South? It was probably harder to go to school there, I would think. Before the war, there were not as many schools in the South as in the North, and these were mostly private schools. If your parents had the money, you were educated at home with a tutor or a governess, and then sent to a private high school. Some children were taught at home by family members. Black children were seldom taught how to read or write. However, some children learned from watching their white playmates. Frederick Douglass, who became a well-known speaker against slavery as an adult, bought secret lessons with pieces of bread from poor neighborhood white boys when he was a house slave in Baltimore. He believed that learning to read was important in his desire to be free. But he was caught and punished many times while he was learning. Slaves who knew how to read and write taught others in pit schools, holes in the ground, hidden so they wouldn't be found. When war began, most tutors became soldiers. Staying alive became more important than education to many families. You may have done farm work and chores around the house rather than study. Women kept a few schools open, and newly printed textbooks soon showed Southern spirit. You could have participated or practiced number problems in which Confederate soldiers whipped Yankees, but many schools closed until the end of the war. Some schools were used as hospitals for the wounded soldiers or prisons for captured soldiers. And like I said, the battles were being fought in the South, so that's where the injuries and the battles took place. Was it hard to get food in the North? Food prices went higher and some families were not able to buy much. Wages for most workers were about $2.50 to $3 a day. A work day was 10 to 12 hours. During the war, eggs cost as much as $6 a dozen, and bacon cost 15 cents a pound. Prices rose as much as 75%. Rice, sweet potatoes, citrus fruits, and pecans were hard to find since food from the South did not come north. Most meals were meat and potatoes. Boiled chicken or beef was often eaten with the Irish potatoes. A plate of beans, potatoes, ham or corned beef, bread, and coffee would cost 15 cents. Food was often fried in butter, lard, or bacon grease. Vegetables were well cooked, with corn being the most popular. Fruit was eaten at every meal. Desserts such as cake and pie were very well liked. For most families, the main meal of the day was eaten at noon. Children came from school and the father came from work for dinner. Supper would be a lighter meal, such as cold meat and potato salad and fresh fruit, and would be eaten at 6 o'clock. If a family worked and could not get home at noon, supper became the main meal. The business of canning food was started at this time. Soldiers were given canned food when they went on a march. Sometimes they brought a tin home for their families to try. Canned milk was a very new thing. Canned fruit like peaches or cherries was a treat in winter. Sometimes families or soldiers ran out of food, but neighbors and churches would help. The Sanitary Commission was a special group started by the government to help soldiers. Was it hard to get food in the South? Food was harder to get as the war went on and on. Union soldiers, called bummers, sometimes took food and livestock from the Southern families or ruined their fields and gardens. Meat was the hardest thing to get since much of it came from hunting. It was also hard to keep. Some meat was cut into strips and sun-dried. Meat was also salted and smoked. Salt was made by boiling salt water or digging up the dirt under the smokehouses. The salt that had fallen off other smoked meats was taken from the dried soil. Things that were grown or gathered were the main foods of most people. Tea was made from the dried leaves of berries. Coffee was made by boiling grain, like wheat or corn. Baking soda, which was used to make bread, was made from the ashes of corn cobs. Molasses or honey was used instead of sugar. The Confederate recipe book gave many hints for what to use for food. Your family may have eaten only 1 or 2 small meals per day so that the food would last as long as possible. Slaves had worked in the house could get leftovers. Field workers were given very small portions of meat and cornmeal, but this wasn't much food after working hard from sunrise to sunset. How did you entertain yourself in the North? There were always a lot to do if you lived in a city like New York. The circus was often in town. There were special music shows called minstrel shows. P.T. Barnum's American Museum of Unusual Sights was well liked. Everyone liked vaudeville shows where dancing, comedy, and singing were done along with a play. Tickets were bought for 15 cents. The war also inspired new kinds of events. The Sanitary Commission had fairs to raise money to help soldiers. Exhibits of captured battle flags and other military items brought huge crowds. Parades were often seen as men marched off to battle. Baseball became popular. Foreign fairs were held in the country. Songs like the Battle Hymn of the Republic and Battle Cry of Freedom were sung all over the North where people got together, especially at the 4th of July parade and celebration. How did you entertain yourself in the South? There was very little time to play duo to chores. You liked games such as Hi Spy, Blind Man's Buff, and Fox and Geese. Of course, playing war was a favorite. When others couldn't join the fun, boys passed the time by swinging on a grapevine or tooting on a whittled flute. Girls had tea with ragdoll or corn shuck friends. Store-bought dolls were almost never seen. Playing checkers by firelight ended many long, tiring days. From around 6 years old, black children were expected to work. You could put the animals in the barn, clean the yard around the house, or run errands until you were old enough to work in the fields. Unless you were told to play with the children of the family, you were punished if you were found playing during the day. How that's terrible. At night, you were usually too tired to play. Black children sang the songs they heard from their parents singing while they worked. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and Follow the Drinking Gourd. And we read that book. They helped pass the long days. How did you support the war in the North? While money was given, when possible, you probably helped in other ways. Girls helped sew hundreds of towels and knit socks. They scraped lint from the cloth that was used to make bandages. Boys used wheelbarrows and wagons to haul things to the packing house. Some older children may have helped their parents run a station on the Underground Railroad. This wasn't a real railroad, and we found that out, didn't we? It was the secret way to get from the South and slavery to the North and freedom. People who helped the slaves escape were called railroad workers. How did you support the war in the South? When Southern soldiers passed by, your family shared food and gave whatever clothing you could spare. Officers may have stayed in your home and come to dinner. Southern women made uniforms for the soldiers and knit clothes. Families close to the hospitals helped with the wounded. You helped by not wasting time. If the weather was warm, you didn't wear shoes. That saved leather. You didn't waste anything, not time. You couldn't waste anything. You ate less food, so the food would go for longer periods of time. Male slaves were often taken from the plantations by the army to help build war defenses. This meant that the slaves left had to work extra hard to get all the work done, or it was left undone. Family members also had to start doing daily chores. How did you get news from the front lines in the North? Before the war, letters would come to the post office or general store, and you would have to pick up your mail. With so many families writing to soldiers, two big changes happened in the Union's mail. First, mail was divided into classes. First class was for letters, second class was for newspapers, and third class was for magazines. The price of postage was by class. Before the war, the price was for how far the item had to travel. Second, mail delivery to the home began in large cities. Letter carriers or postmen took letters right to your door. Late in the war, Union soldiers who wanted to send money home safely could use a postal money order like a bank check. The receiver could take the money order to the local post office and get money in return. How did you get news from the front lines into the South? Getting news about the war or your family in the South was very hard. Often you waited months, sometimes years, to hear news from your family members. Telegraph lines were often cut. Mail that did not make it through the lines had to be picked up at the post office or general store, which was often a long walk or ride. Soldiers carrying letters for friends may not have arrived. As long as there was still a supply of newsprint, newspapers like the Vicksburg Citizen and the Richmond Enquirer followed the battles and printed the names of soldiers who were killed, wounded, or captured. Since many people couldn't read, often someone read the news aloud in a public place. Later, newspapers were printed on wallpaper or wrapping paper. Now remember, that's where the war was going on. It's harder to get information around because they were having the battles. And like they said, people in the South were a little less educated, couldn't read. So that's why you want to read. All right, here's some important people that you would hear about in the North. Everyone talked about President Abraham Lincoln and the way he was running the war. Lincoln had grown a beard because 11-year-old Grace Bedell told him he would look better with one. He worked closely with many Army generals, including George B. McClellan, Ambrose Burnside, George Meade, Ulysses S. Grant, and William T. Sherman. This is a picture up close of Lincoln, Sherman. Then down here was McClellan. And I was sure they'd have one of Grant. He was an important general on the Union side. When Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a book that showed the evils of slavery, he is said to have called her the little woman who made this big war. Escaped slaves like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass gave talks to tell people to fight for freedom of the slaves. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw led the most well-known black Army unit, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, very important abolitionist. And this was Robert Shaw, right here. And then that lady is Harriet Beecher Stowe. Matthew Brady's photographs let those at home see these people. Photography was new, so people wanted to see the real battlefield pictures. Photographers followed the Army in wagons that became traveling darkrooms. Another kind of art was made by Thomas Nast. He made drawings during the war. Women were very busy helping the sick and wounded at the battlefields and in government hospitals. Dorothea Dix set up a group of nurses. They were paid 40 cents per day by the government. Clara Barton took food and medicine right to the battlefield lines. Dr. Mary Walker became the first woman officer in the U.S. Army. She was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for her bravery. That would be kind of like a hospital look, be tense. All right, here's some people, famous people you would hear about in the South during the Civil War. I'll show you their pictures first. Jefferson Davis, I told you, was the president of the states that left the Union during this time. Robert E. Lee was a big general. He was like Ulysses S. Grant was for the Union. Robert E. Lee was for the Confederate. This is Stonewall Jackson. and Jeb Stuart. Every child in the South knew of Jefferson Davis and General Robert E. Lee. You knew Davis had been elected the president of the Confederacy and that he chose Lee to lead the Southern troops. Lee had resigned from the Northern Army when Virginia left the Union. He made the battle plans and led his troops on his horse, Traveler. That was his horse's name, Traveler. While he was a great soldier, he really didn't like fighting. He loved his family and enjoyed having his feet tickled by his children when he read them stories. Lee was greatly admired by all Southerners. Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, James Longstreet, A.P. Hill, John Mosby, and Nathan Bedford Forrest were other well-known soldiers. While white and black people had heard of a person called Moses who worked on the Underground Railroad. This wasn't a real railroad, and we've read about this before, but it's in this book. I'll read some more. This wasn't a real railroad. It was the secret code name for any route from the South to freedom in the North. Many people helped slaves leave the South for northern states or Canada. Slave catchers, men who caught runaway slaves, tried to locate Moses and stop this from happening. Slaves waited for the call that it was time to go. Few knew that Moses was really, does anybody know who it was? It was a lady, Harriet Tubman. They didn't realize it was a woman. Okay, where was I? Okay, Tubman herself had escaped as a slave from Maryland. She led thousands of people out of the South to the North. She also went into the South toward the end of the war to let slaves know that they had been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. You need to remember that. Emancipation Proclamation. That was when they were freed by which President Lincoln had signed in January 1863 that said African Americans were free. But see, the South was in the middle of the war. They wouldn't have found out, so she went back and told them. What words and expressions came from life in the North? General Ambrose Burnside, who wore bushy side whiskers, was the model for the style known as sideburns. You see people wearing sideburns, they don't wear them much anymore, but they used to wear them way down here. It'd be all thick. It's kind of like part of the beard on a man's face. In 1861, the government printed money called greenbacks because of the ink color. Bummers, these are just words you might have heard back then. Bummers, who were soldiers who roamed the countryside looking for food and valuables, has been shortened to our present bums. The word mailman became common when free home delivery of the mail in the cities was started. Women started to use the word shampoo when they washed their hair. Okay? Words that were expressions of life in the South. The term Dixie was a nickname for the South before the war. It may have started because of Mason-Dixon line that divides Pennsylvania and Maryland. Another story is that it came from the $10 bill, which was marked Dix, D-I-X, French for 10. Those in the Mississippi riverboat business called the bills Dixies, and the place where they came from was Dixieland. The song, I Wish I Was in Dixieland, was played as Jefferson Davis became president of the Confederacy, and it became a symbol for the South. At the end of the war, the North set up the governments in the defeated Southern states. Southerners who worked with these new governments were called scalawags. And we would have read about all this if we had been in school. Northerners who came from the South to sell needed items at high prices, or control the vote of the former slaves were called carpetbaggers, due to their traveling bags made of carpet-like material. How did life in the North change after the war? Okay, this is important because after the war, they had to rebuild much of the South. And they also had to make a lot of people in the South conform. They didn't have slaves anymore. It was a rough time, Reconstruction. And I don't know if you know this. I hate to tell you something that I'll tell you. If it doesn't say it, I'll tell you in a minute. But we didn't have the Reconstruction like we would have because of a terrible thing that happened to our president. You probably already know. How did life in the North change after the war? There were about 360,000 casualties on the Union side of the war. If your family had lost a loved one, you still felt the pain. The end of the war brought good things for some people and more loss for others. There were more factories than before the war, so there were more jobs. These were often given to the returning soldiers, so many women left the workforce. Women who still held jobs were paid less than the men workers. Unfair, and still today that happens some, ladies. We need to keep working on that. Newly invented machines such as grain mowers and reapers made farming easier, and clothing could be produced faster with sewing machines. Companies grew larger. Their low-pay workers felt they could strike for more money and end the 14-hour workday. Going on strike was unpatriotic during the war. Many freed slaves moved into the North and only found low-paying jobs. President Lincoln hoped for a quick and peaceful reunion of the southern states to the Union. He wanted to make the divided House whole. He wanted to bring them back together and everybody work together. Others in the government felt the South needed to be punished. Lincoln was assassinated before his wishes for pardoning the southern states could come true. Okay, so he was killed. And so the way he wanted to carry out Reconstruction didn't completely happen. Andrew Johnson then became president. He was not able to do what Lincoln had planned. The northern states gained a lot of power in the government, but it was at the cost of many lives. How did life in the South change after the war? There were about 260,000 casualties. That means deaths on the side of the South. That was a lot of people back then. A lot of people. It's a lot of people now, but it really was a lot then. It took a long time for the South to recover from the ruin of the war. Cities and towns had to be rebuilt. Farmland had to be reworked and planted without the use of slaves. Railroad and telegraph lines needed to be reset. People had to live with little or no money and few belongings. The war had touched your life every day for 4 years. It was hard to believe it was really over. The people who had been slaves also had to make big adjustments. The Emancipation Proclamation had given them freedom, but life was hard. Most ex-slaves had no education and had little or no money. Schools and other public places were still divided by color. Some freed blacks worked for their former owners for money, but others left for the North and where they hoped to get their own land. Many people from the North came south at the end of the war. Some came to teach the freed slaves, but others came to control and punish according to the Reconstruction Act passed by the North. Excuse me. The Union Army took over the government. The South was treated like a hated enemy. This was what Lincoln had not wanted to happen. But he wasn't there, so they went against his wishes. The hardest and slowest thing to change were people's feelings. Losing made the Southerners accept the power of the national government. You were part of the whole. You also had to recognize that the slaves were free and had the same rights of citizenship. Your world changed a lot during the war, and life was never the same again. But it's a good thing. Took a long time, but honestly, slavery was so wrong, and I'm glad it's gone. But it did take them a while to get used to it. A big way of their life was gone forever. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this book. Tomorrow we'll start our little fun book, okay? I also put on there your new reading theme this week is to dress in your East Rockingham blue or gold, and take a picture of yourself reading a book and send it to me, or you could send it to Miss Caraway. I like to get them because I forward them on to her, but I like to see who sent them. Thank you to Lauren for always sending them, and I hope every other people will do the same this week. So have a great week, and I'll see you reading tomorrow.